What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another video. It is officially 2025, New Year's Day when I'm recording this. So hopefully everyone had a great holiday season and is ready for a kick-ass 2025. You may notice that although I am wearing the exact same hat as I wear for most of my videos, today this hat is going to act as a myth-busting hat because we are going to go over 9 myths about Special Forces Assessment and Selection Prep, aka SFAS, aka your first step towards becoming a potential Green Beret. And the main reason I want to make this video about myths is because in the modern world, 2025, and before that, anyone who wants to can go online and type something or say something, whether or not they are experienced or whether or not they are an expert. And they can say something worked for them, something didn't work for them, something you should do, something you shouldn't do. This is the best way. This is the worst way. And I am here as a former Green Beret who attended SFAS in 2012, as well as a current fitness coach who helps guys prepare for SFAS. I've sent dozens of guys to SFAS in the last couple of years since I started coaching. So I believe that gives me some solid credibility and ability to kind of talk about these myths, dispel them, and tell you what to actually do instead and what to actually consider when you are going about your SFAS prep. So before we hop into the video, I'm going to put the 9 myths as a little preview here on the screen. But if you don't mind taking a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, that'll help me reach more people, and I would be forever grateful. I plan on continuing to put as much effort as I possibly can into making as much valuable content as I can here on YouTube, and it makes it more fulfilling when more people can benefit from it. So thank you very much for your support and your continued support, and really excited to keep getting after it in 2025. So let's hop into myth number 1, which states if your selection prep is harder than actual selection, when you show up to selection, it's going to feel like a walk in the park. It's going to be super easy. So why is this not very good advice? Why is this a myth? Well, if you decided that you were going to prep for a marathon and you asked me, what should I do for training to improve my chances of finishing a marathon as fast as I can? And I told you the best thing you should do is just run 30 miles every single time you run. That way, when you have to run 26.2 miles, the distance of a marathon, it just feels a lot easier. And I don't think you have to be a running expert or a running coach, or maybe even someone who is interested in running at all, to know that that's not very sound advice. Professional runners, typically the best marathon runners in the world, usually their long runs cap out at maybe 22 miles, sometimes maybe 25 miles, but rarely do they even run a marathon in training, let alone run more than a marathon in training, let alone run more than a marathon every training session so that the marathon feels easy. That is just not how the human body works. SFAS is designed to break soldiers down and see how they withstand it, see how much they can withstand in situations of stress, discomfort, food deprivation, sleep deprivation. The guys who still perform well and the guys who still keep their wits about them and can continue to show that they belong day after day are the guys who hang on. Now, there's a big difference between what you can withstand and what you can actually recover and adapt to. So if you're only seeing what you can possibly withstand in training by trying to mimic selection, or even worse, make it harder than selection, then you're just going to break yourself down before you even go. And you're going to show up you're either going to get injured during your prep, or you're going to show up extremely fatigued, extremely beat up, and already behind the power curve before you even start going to a selection process that is designed to beat you down. So what should you do? You should build yourself up in training. You should give yourself challenging training for sure, in a progressive manner, specific to the demands of selection, running, rucking, calisthenics, carries, strength work, but in a way that you can actually recover and adapt to it so that you actually get better and you show up to selection fit, not incredibly fatigued or not getting injured along the way. So although your training should absolutely be challenging and difficult, it should not be just like selection, because you're going to show up completely destroyed if you go about it that way, and your chances of getting selected are that much lower. Which brings us into myth number 2. You don't need to ruck all that much, so long as you do plenty of running and you ruck maybe once in a while. So there are certain philosophies out there where people believe because rucking is a highly stressful activity and it's considered usually not very longevity friendly and it beats people up when they ruck too much, it should not necessarily be trained frequently, and that you can instead do plenty of running. You can do plenty of Stairmaster work. You can do plenty of incline walking and strength training, and that will transfer over sufficiently to rucking. Now, there are absolutely people who have done this in the past. This is one example of like an N of one thing. It worked for me, so this is what you should do. There are people who have done it in the past and shown up and been successful. However, it is not the optimal approach. My belief towards really anything in life, but in this situation, my belief towards approaching selection is that you should go into selection aiming to put your absolute best performance up so that you are giving yourself the very best chance possible of making it. And while you might be able to get away with less frequent rucking and just using other modalities to transfer over to your rucking, you may be able to do that and show up and still be successful, but you're not going to be as successful as you otherwise would had you rucked more in your training. I actually did a little bit of back of the napkin math when thinking about this video, and depending on the person, depending on mostly your team week fate, as well as your ability to land nav well, you're going to spend anywhere from 3 to 4 times the amount of time at selection throughout the 3-week process rucking as you will sleeping. So that should tell you that you're going to have a ruck on a lot. And the principle of specificity when it comes to training is the body adapts and improves performance to specific stimulus. So basically what that means is if you want to get better at a certain thing, a specific skill like rucking, you should be rucking. For whatever reason, people are very, very quick to discuss the principle of specificity and say how important it is. But for whatever reason, it just doesn't apply to rucking. And I have yet to see a really good solid argument where I would agree with that methodology or that philosophy. So just because you can get away with maybe rucking less doesn't necessarily mean it's the best approach. Your body is an adaptation machine. So really any stimulus you give your body, so long as it's reasonable and it's not absolutely ridiculous, and you start low and you increase over time, you progress over time, progressive overload, your body can adapt to it. That's literally the premise of all training. So just because the way most people approach rucking, which is very haphazardly, they start with way too much weight. They start going way too hard at the beginning. They start going way too long at the beginning. They make big jumps in progression and it beats them up. Just because some people do that, it's not rucking. It is their approach to rucking that beats them up and decreases their longevity and makes them more banged up before they go to selection. So if you approach it properly and you make these reasonable progressions over time, your body is going to adapt to that stressor. And one of the main reasons you want to adapt to rucking is because it is a highly stressful activity. So if you have only been doing running without any weight, if you've only been walking uphill, which is low impact, if you've only been doing Stairmaster for your cardio or primarily doing those things, when you actually are forced to wear a ruck for 3 straight weeks every day for several hours every single day, your body is not going to have made those adaptations and it's going to be a lot more of a shock to you. So I would suggest rucking probably at least for most people twice a week, maybe occasionally 3 times a week. Usually you don't need 3, but it'll allow you to positively adapt to the stress of rucking. That way, when you get there and you have a ruck on every single day for hours, you are much better able to handle it. You're less likely to get injured. And most importantly, you perform a lot better because you are used to it because you've done it in training. Which brings us to myth number 3. Your squat, bench, and deadlift needs to be X number of pounds. Okay, so unless I am completely missing something or unless something is brand new in 2025, there is no powerlifting competition at SFAS, which means because there's no powerlifting competition, which tests your squat, bench, deadlift, 1 rep max, you don't have to do those exact movements with a barbell during your prep. Now, these lifts are a great proxy for strength, and they are a great way to build strength for lots of people, and they're accessible to a lot of people, and they're not bad exercises. Most people would benefit from doing the squat, bench, and deadlift in their prep at some point, but it does not have to be the exact version that most people think. It doesn't have to be powerlifting style squat, bench, deadlift. In other words, you don't need to use a barbell and you don't need to hit certain numbers. So for example, if you hear that you need to hit some sort of squat number and you're not there yet, and you don't like barbell squatting just because you're not built well for it, or you don't have great mobility for it, Of course, you should consider improving your mobility and being able to get to where you can squat, but you don't necessarily have to do it with a barbell. And some people are just not built very well for barbell squats. Or in other cases, maybe they are, but they just get better stimulus and less fatigue from another lift, like a hack squat or a pendulum squat or a safety bar squat or something similar that's still loading and training the squat movement, still strengthening the muscles that the barbell squat strengthens, but it's less fatiguing, it bangs them up less, and therefore they're able to recover and continue training while still also developing just as much strength as they need to show up prepared. Bench press, same thing. You can absolutely do barbell bench if it works well for you and you feel good from it and it doesn't bang you up. But if it does, you don't have to force yourself to do it. You can use a Swiss bar, which is a neutral grip bar. You can use dumbbells. You can do deficit push-ups. You can do weighted push-ups. You can do dips or weighted dips or machine dips. You can even do machine press. And that's still going to strengthen the same muscles as the bench press. But if it bangs you up less and you get better stimulus from it, then you're totally fine. Deadlift, same thing. I would say the deadlift is probably the most inappropriate for most people. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a good lift, or if you get great results from the deadlift and you really like it, it doesn't beat you up, that you shouldn't do it. It just means that more people than not struggle to do the deadlift with good form, or because their body proportions are not ideal for the deadlift, it's not a great lift for them. It ends up being a lot more of a stress on their lower back than an actual way to build glute and hamstring strength. Luckily, there are tons and tons of different hinge variations. The deadlift is a hinge movement that you can use a barbell for, that you can use hex bars for, that you can use dumbbells for, or even a belt squat machine, or a less conventional method to load the hinge pattern. And so long as your posterior chain is strong, whether you deadlift or not, so long as your upper body pushing is strong, whether you bench press or not, so long as your lower body squatting muscles are strong, whether you back squat or not with a barbell, you're going to be good to go. And there's no exact number for everyone. I have seen numbers out there and I have put numbers out there as proxies, but I've also always included nuance about just remember that you don't necessarily have to do these lifts. And if they're not good lifts for you, you should probably consider doing something else. So don't listen to people who say that your barbell, squat, bench, and deadlift numbers have to be a certain thing, or even that you have to do those lifts. So long as you're strong and you train with movements that stimulate muscle growth and strength and allow you to continue training and continue progressing, then you're going to be good to go. Which brings us into myth number 4. You need to get your grip strength to where it absolutely never fails. All right, so grip strength, endurance in particular, how long you can carry moderate 45 to 60 pound weights in your hand for long periods of time is incredibly important. It's critical for SFAS success. However, the way that team week, which is the part of selection that requires the most grip strength, the way it's set up is for everybody pretty much to fail at some point. Unless you are a former strongman turned endurance athlete, your grip is probably going to fail at some point when you're at selection. You might have to take a break. You might have to switch hands. You might have to switch out with a buddy on your team. That's kind of the way it's designed. And some guys will go into selection really overemphasizing grip strength. Of course, it's important, but you can also overdo it and you can over ruminate about it. And you can try and come up with these ridiculous standards for SFAS grip strength endurance. And that can be problematic because you kind of lose sight of training other important things, or you just overdo it and it ends up fatiguing you more than it actually helps you improve your grip strength. And it ends up shooting you in the foot. And you go in, and even though you trained grip a ton and you thought about it a ton and you stressed about it a ton, your grip is not as strong as it otherwise would be if you were more reasonable about it. So you absolutely should show up with great grip strength endurance. And you definitely don't want to be the guy on your team that drops everything first, or that needs the most breaks, or that is the weak link in any way, shape, or form. But don't expect to never fail. Don't expect to get to where you can just carry a 55-pound weight, whether it's a water can or an ammo can, forever and ever without ever having to switch out. It's just not necessary to over ruminate about, and it's just going to detract from your overall potential results. So as long as you are frequently training carries in various different configurations, single arm carries, double arm carries, maybe doing some hangs, maybe doing some towel pull-ups, maybe doing some legless rope climbs, maybe doing some rice bucket things or captains of crush grippers, you're going to be good to go. Just don't overdo it and don't overthink it. Which brings us into number 5. Your boots and sock choices are make or break. Okay, so everybody loves to talk about the best boots. What are the best boots? What are the best socks? What should I wear for boots? Should I try this, this, and this? I am not saying that you shouldn't put any thought or research or experimentation into your boot selection, because it is important. But a lot of people lose sleep over their boot selection and their sock selection. And I am saying that that is not a very good idea. So it's not a meaningless thing, but it's also not something to over ruminate about, just like the last one. The most important thing you can do is decide on a pair of boots, start wearing them, break them in, and most importantly, break your feet in. Instead of trying to get this perfect Cinderella story where you find this perfect boot and it's amazing and you're just good to go, that's a complete pipe dream. Just like any other part or system of your body can adapt, so can your feet. So you want to allow your feet to adapt to the boots that you're wearing. You want to break the boots in, you want to break your feet in and make your feet indestructible. I kind of say this tongue in cheek, but honestly, guys who are ready for selection, truly ready to go smash, could show up and pass selection in wingtip shoes or Crocs for that matter. Boots are definitely important, but they are not everything. The most important thing is that you find a pair and you break them in and you get your feet tough and resilient so that you can continue walking day after day after day. And the best way to do that is continue walking in your boots and continue to increase your volume, increase your duration, increase the frequency with which you wear them. And before you know it, your feet are going to be indestructible. I never got one single blister at selection, and I'm not saying that's required or that's something that everyone should expect. There's a genetic component to blisters, but also there's a training component and a resiliency development component to your feet that go into avoiding blisters. So of course, you can absolutely still pass selection with blisters, but life is a whole lot better when you don't get them. And the best way to avoid them is to make your feet indestructible. Which brings us into myth number 6. You should practice running and rucking while calorie depleted or carb depleted, and or you should do some of your training in a sleep deprived state to prep for the conditions that you're going to see at selection. So let's talk about the calorie/carb depleting first. There are certain endurance athletes out there that will do depletion runs where they intentionally eat low carb, or they intentionally restrict their calories, or they intentionally run fasted during training to get their body better at using fat for fuel, to make themselves what's called more metabolically flexible so they can switch back and forth. Sometimes they do their runs well fed and well fueled. Sometimes they don't. And it allows them to switch back and forth between using fat and using carbs for fuel. However, the data on this is very, very inconclusive. It's very mixed. There are definitely some people who believe it works. There are other people who think it's kind of a waste of time. But either way, whether it works or not, they're not doing this as they prep for a big race. They're not doing this a couple months out from their marathon that they want to set a PR in or they want to win. They're doing this way, way, way in the off season when that training session really doesn't matter that much, because that training session that they do intentionally depleted is going to be a subpar performance. Just how physiology works. When you don't fuel well, you don't really perform well, which for some people, if they believe in this philosophy, is an okay trade-off, something they're fine with. But as soon as they get into serious prep for their actual race or their event, no more carb depletion runs or no more glycogen depletion runs. They actually fuel themselves because their performance every single session really counts. And in this case, because you're prepping for selection, even though you're not going to have access to sufficient calories or sufficient carbohydrates or sufficient really anything, just because that's the case while you're there does not mean that should be the case during your training. You want to fuel every single training session so that you can get the most out of them and you can recover as quickly as possible and adapt as quickly as possible, which, oh, by the way, requires really good fueling, plenty of protein, plenty of carbohydrates, plenty of calories, plenty of hydration. So if you are intentionally, maybe week to week, doing a workout where you are going in depleted and you don't perform well in that workout, you're kind of leaving gains on the table. You're leaving progress on the table by intentionally not performing well in that training session. So if you want to do this maybe 6 months out just to get your body sort of used to training in a more depleted state, it's fine. Is it going to help all that much? Most likely not. But absolutely don't do this as you approach selection. You're leaving gains on the table and you're going to show up less prepared. Sleep is a totally different thing. Intentionally depriving yourself of sleep because you want to practice being sleep deprived at selection is a fool's errand. You're not going to benefit from that at all. If you have the mental fortitude required to get through selection and become a Green Beret, then you're going to have the mental fortitude when the situation comes to navigate life while deprived of sleep. So this is not something that you just practice beforehand just to see how it goes. Most people also have been sleep deprived before. So you've probably felt sleep deprivation in the past. Doing it during your SFAS prep, however, will detract from your performance, recovery, and ultimate results. So you're going to show up less prepared because you are intentionally depriving yourself of one of the most important aspects of recovery and performance, both from a physical as well as a mental standpoint. So this should never even cross your mind, sleep depriving yourself intentionally to practice it. This is a bridge that you cross when you get there. And I would argue that both of these are bridges you cross when you get there. I promise, if you have a little bit of fortitude and you really want to be there, you really want to crush, you're going to be okay. Which brings us into myth number 7, which is if you're on the weaker side, but an absolute monster at running and rucking, an absolute endurance monster, you have no chance. And this one is very polarizing because essentially the opposite is true. You could be lacking a little bit of strength compared to, say, other candidates, but be an absolute monster running and rucking and still fare very, very well. If you are on the fence endurance wise, but you're super duper strong in the gym, you very well may not even get to the parts of selection where strength is most beneficial for candidates. The very first week is almost all endurance. The second week is mostly endurance. Of course, there's a strength component to rucking. If you're super duper weak and you can't carry your ruck, that's one thing. But I'm not really talking about really, really weak people who weigh 125 pounds and just came off the professional marathon running circuit, have never lifted weights in their life. I'm talking about people who are maybe not as strong as they'd like to be, or maybe not as strong as some of their buddies around them, but are absolute monsters under a ruck as well as running. That type of avatar actually has a very good prognosis for SFAS, whereas the guys who really, really struggle with endurance, or they just didn't really take their prep very seriously and they didn't do enough running or enough rucking, and maybe they don't have a background of it, but they usually do have a background of strength. Like maybe they were a Division I football player or a former power lifter or a former strongman, but they just let their endurance slide a little bit. Those guys have way less of a chance. If they make it to team week, they might do all right. But newsflash, team week is also very endurance biased because it's not just picking things up and putting them down. It's picking things up, moving for miles and miles, then putting them down, then doing it again and again and again all day, then doing it the next day for 4 straight days. So selection is an endurance biased event with a non-trivial strength component. So if you are not biasing endurance in your train up and you're just worried about gym strength and focusing on that, getting jacked and getting strong, and you let your endurance slide, you are going to show up and not very, very well. So definitely prioritize endurance and make sure that you show up capable of running and rucking day after day after day, hour after hour, continuously at a high level without significant drop off or without injury. And you're giving yourself a much better chance of success. Which brings us into the second to last myth, myth number 8. You need to be doing 2-a-days. So this one is a partial myth because I would argue that for some people, in some situations, doing 2-a-days would be slightly more optimal than training once a day, especially if you're doing days where you have a strength session plus an endurance session in the same day. However, if you're on a reasonable SFAS prep plan, you're not going to be doing lifting plus conditioning every single day. And usually, although this could potentially be beneficial for some people, usually you're not going to be doing 2 conditioning sessions in the same day. It's just a little bit excessive. It could absolutely work if you have the time for it and the recovery for it, and you know how to split it up and you know how to program. But usually that's not the case. Typically, maybe a couple days a week, you might have a strength session and an endurance session in the same day. And to ensure that you're as optimally fueled and prepared for both of those sessions and rested, it can make sense to break them into 2. Do strength in the morning, conditioning in the evening, or vice versa. But even if you do have that and your schedule or your life does not allow for you to split them up, you can also do them back to back. I would recommend doing your strength session followed by your conditioning session and considering some intra-workout fuel. And you still got 2 sessions in that day, except they were kind of back to back. Very, very slightly less optimal, but still splitting hairs. What it comes down to is your ability to progress and recover. You could do 2 training sessions, 3 training sessions, 4 training sessions every single day and show up absolutely smashed and terribly prepared. You could do 1 training session every single day, or not even every day, 5 days a week, 6 days a week, and show up ready to smash. Absolutely almost as fully prepared as you possibly can. So the number of times you train each day is a very, very tiny piece of the puzzle, and it's a lot less important than a lot of people think it is. So again, what matters for you is something you can sustain, something your schedule allows for, something that you can consistently hit your training sessions, and most of all, something you can recover from, adapt to, and continue improving upon. Whether that involves 1 training session most days, 2-a-days occasionally, whether it involves multiple days per week of 2-a-days, or whether it just involves 1 training session per day. Those are the things that are important, and that is what's going to determine whether you're prepared or not physically. Which brings us into our last and final myth. You need at least 1 year to prepare for SFAS. Now, another partial myth, because I would argue that for most people, it's totally a good idea to start thinking about your SFAS prep a year out or even 2 years out or more than that if you'd like. However, I always caution people against being what I call perpetual selection preppers. Do not be a perpetual selection prepper. What does that mean? You just follow an SFAS program over and over and over again. I got a year and a half till I go to SFAS. I'm just going to grab this program and follow it over and over again, or I'm going to grab these 3 different SFAS programs and just follow them one after the other. If you do that, you are going to hit many points of diminishing returns. Professional athletes, whether they're performance athletes or sport athletes, they have an off season, they have a preseason, they have an in-season, they have a postseason. Although guys prepping for selection are not the same thing, it should show you that if you're always doing what I would consider to be a preseason thing, your SFAS prep, if you just match that up to preseason, very similar, you're trying to peak for a performance, or pre-race, even more applicable, you're going to burn yourself out. You're going to hit points of diminishing return. You are going to be doing this very longevity unfriendly process that is selection prep over and over and over again. And you're not going to get the results you want. So you want to periodize things. You want to break things down into phases. When you're far out from selection, 1 year plus, you want to be thinking about identifying your weaknesses. What are your main weaknesses as it pertains to selection? Are you really strong, but not great at endurance? Are you good at running, but not great at rucking? Vice versa. Do you struggle with calisthenics? Do you have weight to lose? Whatever it is. I have a full podcast episode I'll put in the description that goes over a full 1 year plan for SFAS prep. From there, you want to start developing your general physical preparedness. You want to focus on becoming a little bit more well-rounded than you are, developing your overall athleticism with a slight bias towards your weaknesses. So for example, if you suck at running, you'd start building your rucking base. If you're an endurance guy, but you have no strength, you'd start getting stronger. As you get closer to selection, you want to start transitioning into more specificity. Generally speaking, I don't recommend specifically training for selection for much longer than 12 weeks or 3 months. Some people can get away with 8 weeks. Some people can get away with 16 weeks. But if you're around that 12-week area of your specific prep, which means prior to that, you've built really good general physical preparedness, not specific, but general. Once you change over to being more specific, you're just going to make a lot more progress. You're going to make a lot more gains. Typically, the first time you follow any program, that's the most gains you're ever going to get from that program, the most progress you're ever going to make. So if you follow 9 selection prep programs in a row, what do you think your progress is going to look like on the 9th one? How burnt out do you think you'll be mentally? How banged up do you think you'll be physically? I can answer that for most people, and it's going to be very, very banged up, very burnt out, and very stagnated in your progress. So start thinking about it as soon as you want, but don't start preparing for it if you're a year out, 6 months out. Wait till you're about 3 months out, give or take, and get real specific, show up, and get ready to crush. So that wraps it up, guys. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know which myth you believed or which myth you want to chat more about in the comment section. And we will be back soon with another video. Happy New Year. Terminator out.